The wind was a blade against Alara's cheek, sharpening its edge on the jutting bones of a face that had forgotten the feel of a full meal. It scoured the hardpan dirt of Redemption Creek's main street, lifting dust and scorn in equal measure, and hurled both at the slender woman and the small, coughing bundle clutched in her arms. Each shuttered window was an eye cold and judging. Each wisp of smoke from a warm chimney was a phantom of the comfort she could not provide. Her late husband's name, once a shield, was now just a whisper of debt and pity that clung to her like the frost whitening the collar of her threadbare coat. She had knocked on every door that held a flicker of charity, offering the work of her hands, the strength of her back, but had been met only with averted gazes and the hard click of a locking bolt. There was one last place, a place whispered about, a homestead carved into the unforgiving granite of the foothills, a place as isolated as the man who lived there. The walk was a pilgrimage of desperation. With each step, the pretense of the town fell away, replaced by the raw, untamed honesty of the wilderness. Gnarled pines clawed at the gray sky, and the silence was broken only by the rasp of her son's breathing and the frantic drumming of her own heart. Leo felt impossibly light, a fragile bird with weakening wings. His fever was a low, persistent fire she could not quench. Finally, through a curtain of swirling snow, she saw it. A cabin, stout and low, braced against the land as if it had grown from it. Smoke, thick and white, rose from its stone chimney, a defiant flag of life in the vast emptiness. A man stood by a woodpile, his back to her, the rhythmic fall of his axe a steady, percussive heartbeat in the frozen air. He was broad-shouldered, clad in worn buckskin, moving with a grim economy of motion that spoke of long acquaintance with hardship. He stopped, axe held mid-swing, sensing her presence before he saw her. When he turned, his face was all plains and shadow, a beard dusted with snow, his eyes the color of a winter sky just before a blizzard. They held no warmth but no judgment either. They simply observed. Alara's own courage, a small, sputtering candle, threatened to extinguish. The words she had rehearsed, the pleas she had polished with shame, caught in her throat. She looked from the man's impassive face to the child in her arms, whose shivering had subsided into a terrifying stillness. That sight broke the dam of her pride. She stumbled forward, sinking to her knees in the thin layer of snow a few feet from him. The cold seeped through her worn skirt instantly, a final, numbing insult. She did not look up, fixing her gaze on his heavy, mud-caked boots. "Sir," she began, her voice a raw crackle. "My son, he is sick. We have nothing," she swallowed, forcing the rest out, each word a stone of humiliation she was forced to swallow. "I am a hard worker. I can mend, I can clean, I can cook. I can warm your bed, milk your cow. Please." Her voice broke, the plea dissolving into a ragged sob. "Please, simply feed my child." Silence answered her. It stretched, taut and agonizing, pulled thin by the ceaseless whine of the wind. She dared to lift her eyes. He had not moved. His gaze was no longer on her, but on the pale, small face of her son, nestled against her shoulder. For a long moment, the world consisted only of three figures in the snow: a desperate mother, a dying child, and a silent, unreadable man. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he lowered the axe and drove its head into the chopping block. He gave a single, curt nod. It was not an offer of kindness. It was an acceptance of terms. The cabin was a world of wood and firelight, stark and masculine. A single room, impeccably clean, held a cot, a rough-hewn table, and 2 chairs. Everything smelled of pine, wood smoke, and something else, a clean, lonely scent. Silas. He had not offered his name. She'd heard it in the town's fearful whispers, gestured with his chin toward the fire. Alara moved stiffly, her frozen limbs protesting, and settled Leo onto the worn bearskin rug near the hearth. The child didn't stir, his breath a shallow flutter in the heavy silence. Silas ladled broth from a pot hanging over the flames into a bowl and handed it to her without a word. It was thin but hot, and as she spooned the liquid past Leo's cracked lips, a few drops at a time, she felt a fragile tendril of hope unfurl in her chest. For the first few days, a silent routine governed their lives. She would wake before dawn, startled by the quiet efficiency with which he moved. He would already have the fire stoked, its orange light pushing back the shadows. While he saw to the livestock in the pre-dawn gloom, she would sweep the floor, dust the few surfaces, and prepare a meager breakfast of oatmeal. She ate only after watching Leo swallow his portion, her own hunger a dull, familiar ache. She learned the rhythms of the homestead, the stubborn pull of the milk cow's teats against her chapped hands, the precise way to stack firewood so it would shed the snow, the patience required to patch a shirt with thread that was almost too thick for the needle. She worked relentlessly, desperate to prove her worth, to fill her side of the unspoken bargain. Every night, she would spread her own thin blanket on the floor by the hearth, as far from his cot as possible, creating a chasm of propriety in the small space. And every night, she would lie awake, listening to the howl of the wind, her body tense, waiting for a footstep, for a hand on her shoulder, for him to collect the part of the debt she had so shamefully offered. But he never did. He moved around her as if she were a piece of furniture he was still learning to navigate. His silence a wall she could not penetrate. He spoke only when necessary, his words clipped and functional. More wood, the bucket is frozen. The snow will be deep by morning. He never used her name. She was simply a presence, a set of hands. Yet, small things began to accumulate in the space between them. One morning, she found a thicker wool blanket folded at the foot of her makeshift bed. Another day, a small, intricately carved wooden bird appeared on the mantelpiece, its smooth lines a stark contrast to the rough-hewn world around it. She watched as Leo, his fever finally broken, his cheeks regaining a faint blush of life, discovered the toy. He held it with a reverence that clutched at Alara's heart. She saw Silas watching from the corner of his eye, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze before he turned back to sharpening a knife. She began to observe him, not with fear, but with a dawning curiosity. She saw the way his large, calloused hands could be gentle as he checked a splint on the cow's leg. She saw the deep weariness that settled on his face when he thought no one was looking, a profound loneliness etched into the lines around his eyes. He was a man walled in by more than just logs and stone. And she realized, with a slow, startling clarity, that his silence wasn't a judgment on her, but a fortress around himself. The winter deepened, locking the world in a vise of ice and snow. The wind, once a blade, became a battering ram, throwing itself against the small cabin in endless, roaring assaults. Inside, the fire was their sun, their singular point of warmth and life against the suffocating white wilderness. The fragile peace they had forged in silence was a tangible thing now, measured in shared meals and the quiet rhythm of chores. Alara no longer felt like a supplicant. She moved with a sense of purpose, her hands sure as she kneaded dough, her voice steady as she told Leo stories by the firelight. The memory of her desperate plea in the snow had not vanished, but it had receded, replaced by the quiet dignity of survival. The trust between them was unspoken, an edifice built of small, solid actions. It had to be, for there were no words for what they were becoming to one another. One evening, as the blizzard reached its zenith, a furious pounding on the door shattered their quiet world. It wasn't the rhythmic knock of a neighbor, but a violent, drunken hammering that vibrated through the floorboards. Leo, startled from his sleep, let out a cry and scrambled into Alara's skirts. Silas, who had been oiling a harness by the fire, rose slowly. His face was a mask of grim control, but Alara saw the muscles in his jaw bunch. He looked at her, a quick, sharp glance that said everything words could not. Stay with the boy. The door shuttered again, and a slurred voice bellowed from the storm. Silas, we know you're in there. Heard you got yourself some company to warm this winter. The voice was followed by a coarse laugh that grated on Alara's nerves. She recognized the sound of Jedediah Croft's braying laugh, a man from the town whose eyes had always lingered on her with a predatory gleam. Silas moved to the door, his movements calm and deliberate. He didn't reach for the rifle mounted over the mantel. He simply stood, a bulwark of quiet menace. "Go home, Jed." His voice was low, yet it carried over the wind's shriek. "You're drunk. Drunk on the cold is all," came the reply. "Open up. We just want to meet the widow who's so willing to milk your cow." Another brutish laugh joined the first. The insult, a twisted echo of her own words of desperation, struck Alara like a physical blow. Shame, hot and sickening, flooded her, but it was immediately consumed by a white-hot surge of rage. These men saw her not as a person, but as a commodity, a rumor, an object for their amusement. They were trying to tear down the sanctuary she and this quiet man had built. Before Silas could move, the door splintered inward, a section of the bolt giving way. A blast of snow and wind invaded the room as two large figures stumbled in, their faces flushed with drink and malice. Jed Croft and his crony, Finn, loomed in the doorway, their eyes fixing on Alara. In that instant, the frightened woman who had knelt in the snow ceased to exist. Alara stood, pushing Leo behind her, her body a shield. Her gaze met Jed's, and for the first time in her life, she did not look away. "Get out," she said, her voice shaking but clear and cold as ice. Jed smirked, taking a step forward. Now, ain't no way to greet guests." But he stopped as Silas moved, placing himself between them and Alara. The air crackled. The confrontation was not loud. It was a thing of deadly quiet. Silas didn't raise his voice. "I said," he repeated, his tone flat and lethal. "Go home." Finn, emboldened by liquor, lunged. The ensuing violence was swift, brutal, and devoid of theatrics. It was the violence of necessity. Silas moved with the unforgiving efficiency of a rockslide, deflecting Finn's clumsy punch and driving him back out into the blizzard with a force that left him gasping in the snow. Jed, momentarily stunned, reached for the knife at his belt. He never cleared the leather. Silas's hand shot out, not in a punch, but an open-palmed strike to the chest that sent Jed staggering backward, tripping over his own feet and crashing into the snow beside his friend. Silas stood in the ruined doorway, a silhouette against the raging storm, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He said nothing more. He didn't have to. The two men, sobered by the sudden, shocking force and the pure, undiluted menace radiating from the silent figure, scrambled to their feet and vanished into the white chaos, their drunken jeers swallowed by the wind. The storm receded with the dawn, leaving behind a world remade, cloaked in a profound and cleansing silence. The sky was a pale, fragile blue, and the sunlight on the fresh snow was blinding. Inside the cabin, the quiet was different. The silence that had once been a barrier of unfamiliarity and caution was now a vessel of shared understanding, a comfortable space that no longer needed to be filled. Silas had repaired the door, his hands moving with the same steady competence with which they did everything. Alara watched him, her heart a slow, steady beat in her chest. The fear and shame that had haunted her for so long felt distant now, like a bad dream half remembered. She had not been a damsel rescued. She had stood her ground. She had found a strength she never knew she possessed, forged in the fire of desperation and tempered by the quiet respect of the man beside her. She noticed a dark stain on the cuff of his shirt and saw a long, shallow gash along his forearm, likely from Jed's fumbling attempt with the knife. She took a clean rag from her small bundle and went to him. She didn't ask. She simply took his arm, her touch gentle but firm. He stiffened for a moment, surprised, then relaxed, allowing her to tend to the wound. His skin was warm beneath her fingers. As she carefully cleaned the cut, she looked up and met his gaze. For the first time, she saw past the stoic guard, past the weariness, and into the man himself. There was a vulnerability there, a deep well of solitude she now understood. "The ground will be hard for a while," he said, his voice quiet in the still room. "But the thaw will come. It'll be ready for planting, come spring." It was the most he had ever said at once. And in those simple words, she heard not a command or a statement, but a question, an offering. He wasn't speaking of the soil. He was speaking of a future, a shared one, built not on a desperate bargain but on the solid bedrock of mutual survival and respect. She finished tying the bandage, and her hand lingered on his arm for a heartbeat longer than necessary. "Yes," she said, her voice soft but sure. "It will later." As the evening light turned the snow outside to shades of rose and violet, they sat by the fire. Leo slept soundly on the bearskin rug, his small hand curled around the smooth, carved bird. The cabin was warm, secure, a bastion against the vast, cold world. Elara looked at the sleeping face of her child, healthy and safe, and then at the quiet man staring into the flames, the firelight catching the gray in his beard. She was no longer the hopeless woman who had knelt in the snow. She was Elara. She was a mother. She was a survivor. And here, in this small, silent space, she was home. The world outside was still harsh, the future uncertain. But for the first time in a lifetime, she was not facing it alone. The warmth in the room was more than the fire. It was the gentle, growing heat of hope.